Welcome to the High Rise Podcast, presented by Headset, the leading data and analytics company for the cannabis industry.
So, Emily, I am really looking forward to hearing about your New York field report today from a state that I would say has always been at the forefront of when it comes to interstate commerce. How was your trip?
Yes. My trip to New York was a good one. I spent time in Brooklyn and in Manhattan. And yeah, it was interesting. It was interesting to see, the headline had just come out a couple days before that there were at least 1,400 unlicensed shops in place in the city in the boroughs of New York. And I was staying in Brooklyn because that's where I used to live before moving out to San Francisco. And I was I was amazed by what I was seeing was a grand opening of a dispensary in Fort Greene area, which is I love that neighborhood, but they had banners, balloons, promotional pieces out front, and signs saying discounted pricing, and people were heading in there. And it strikes me because in stark contrast to that, Smacked was opening on, I think it's on Bleecker Street in the Village, as the second equity retail location in the city or in the entire state that is technically licensed for adult use. Of course, we know SF Housing Works was the first one in the Astor Place area of the Village. This one is also downtown, which is it's interesting. I don't know if you read about it, but it's only going to be open for a month, and then they're closing it for the renovations and moving. I think they're moving the location to actually match what the license is linked to. So I'm perplexed a little bit about it, but I'm glad for that person because it definitely is someone who suffered at the hands of the egregious criminal justice system around cannabis. So I'm very happy for him. But the thing to note is that it's the winter in New York, and it was snowy, slushy, rainy, very, very cold, and there were still lines to get into both of the licensed retailers. And it is a striking comparison to the illicit doors where you can just walk, or unlicensed, I guess is the way to think about it. And licensed doors where you can walk in and out with ease. You can pay with your credit card. You're not paying taxes, or they're not paying taxes like 280. And it's just and by the way, I see the California cannabis brands like Stizzy and others on the shelves there. So it is an interesting experience in New York. In fact, I mean, I've been getting there about once a quarter, and it still hasn't really changed or improved. And it seems like we're still a ways away. Although I did hear they are going to, I think they're on the brink of approving the 30 additional licenses, but there are some things I anticipate will be hiccups to getting those doors open across the state. So I don't know. It was interesting. Have you heard anything else about New York recently?
Yeah, a few things. Nothing that different than what you're hearing or what you saw. But on the stores, like Smacked and everything else, we're working with one that's getting ready to open. I really love the name. It's called Union Square Travel Agency. Have you heard of this one? It's not open yet, but but their whole like tagline is like, now you don't need to get on a plane to go somewhere, right? Like you can
All
buy
right.
I thought it was pretty clever. So it's neat to see that there's still people coming up with clever brands, clever ideas around retail. It's come a long way, I would say, from from the early days where everything was the THC acronym, right? The healing center, the holistic center. You know what I mean? It was always
Green,
that. So
whatever.
green
Yeah.
whatever. So now seeing Union Square Travel Agency, which I think is in the Union Square area when they open, is pretty cool. Speaking of squares in New York, last week Times Square. Did you see this? Where they're cracking down on cannabis consumption, posting signage. It's the age old problem. You've got a legal market, you got a lot of tourists, but you got nowhere to consume it. So everyone's just consuming it in Times Square, right, where all the tourists are. And there's some funny quotes.
Ugh.
There's an article we'll link to this that has some funny quotes, but people. This guy from Holland says, "Not only Times Square, but everywhere I smell weed." And then other people saying, "We were walking down the street and had a really gross smell and thought it was a skunk." That was from a tourist from Indiana. So I just I just love the mayhem that's happening, and it's been like this for a while, right? But it just seems to be with the 1,400 stores or 1,500 I saw recently of these unlicensed locations. I mean, it is everywhere, and I, I mean, the fact that they know there's 1,500, hopefully that's a good starting point for starting to close them up. But we have seen situations in other markets like, Ontario, Canada for the longest time, had so many just pop up and like doing clever things to stick around, right? Like living there. And so they're like, there's this like residency clause. So the police couldn't come in because it was like a lived in unit. I'm not sure how much of that is Canada versus US, but people get real creative when they're raking it in and they don't want to close the doors. So I got to hope that something happens, because the pace of, going from 1,400 of unlicensed stores was that last week was kind of the number from a news report, and now 1,500. If they're opening 100 stores in a week, they're well outpacing adult use licenses in these unlicensed businesses. Chances are they just miscounted. I mean, when the numbers get that big, who cares anymore, right? Just say thousands of stores. But if they really are continuing to open at a frequent rate, it's like whack-a-mole, right? So I don't know what they're going to do, but they need to do something if it's going to stand any sort of chance, I think.
I think you're right. And I thought of a tagline for the Union Square Travel Agency.
Okay.
Get high
This is a
without flying.
freebie. They're not a sponsor.
Yeah, you're welcome. Get high without flying. See, get it? Because you have to fly to travel. Anyway,
That's
okay,
perfect.
so
That's
no,
perfect.
if you have to explain it, it's not perfect. But I do think that's interesting and good for them. I do like that. See, this is what we talked about many, many months ago, is the creativity that will come out of New York. It's a great center of creativity around branding and retail and experiential design. So all these things are really good. So I think that's pretty neat. And I do think you're right about if they're opening 100 a week, that's an issue. Now, one of the things that did happen this week, Syracuse.com, I think, posted this article about that. Remember the $200 million fund that's supposed to fund all of these operations that are opening. This article did a real deep dive on what's gone on with it, and it does sound, I mean, just to sum up, it sounds like the 200 million is not there, and maybe not even 100 million is there. And I can just say, as a fund manager in cannabis, raising money into a fund is pretty hard, and to raise money in kind of a new model around a fund like this is difficult. And so, there's different provisions that were in place around it. But I would say one thing that is a common thread there is that there was a real lack of transparency about how the management team was selected on that and the status of the raising. So it's like, if you're going to implement a program and you don't have the budget to execute upon it, what's the plan? And so it seems like they may have to do some course correcting here, because I don't know if they have the resources to actually pull it off. Now, maybe the state will just fully backstop it, but I'm wondering with what resources and which approval from the state to do so. So it's going to be interesting. But I wouldn't be surprised, the 60-day comment period ended. So I wouldn't be surprised if we see some movement or action from the existing ROs, the registered operators in the state, who are not able to open retail doors for a long period of time per the regulation. So I don't know. It seems like there's probably things in the works around this.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, like every market, just a messy, messy rollout. It's almost like they didn't have years to figure this out.
It's like it's the first time all over again.
Every
Reinventing the
time.
wheel.
Every
Mhm.
time. It's wild. It's wild. It's like a loss for words that this stuff happens.
Yeah.
This late into the game. I mean, we've been doing this forever. And it's a sophisticated state with a lot of resources, right? So you think
Mhm.
these things wouldn't be such an issue.
It's also, I mean, the financial center of the country. And so I
Right.
think there could have been some processes run around how to set this fund up, I mean, I think it is a great initiative, and I fully appreciate the intent behind it. But I think there's a lot of resources that could have been tapped to support it and get it to where it needed to be for the opening. So
Yeah. Yeah. Well, every market's different. We haven't really touched on markets like Connecticut with their stores opening. We're looking at Headset, like working a lot in Missouri right now as they're gearing up. What's wild about Missouri, and I want to talk about brands, is there are so many brands from other markets there, like a surprising amount for a medical market, and that that kind of varies market to market. Sometimes you see a lot, sometimes you don't see a lot. How these things get licensed and structured. But for whatever reason, it's like surprising to see so many brands that I recognize, coming out of a market like that. And, New York, I think the brand awareness is building, right? I know at the top here, making a crack about interstate commerce, because there is a lot of well-known California brands that exist there. And I'm sure brands from other markets as well. And I don't know, it's like the age old thing. It's like people, we need a legal framework because people are buying and consuming cannabis. It's like that's just a given, and it's been a given forever. And so knowing that, it's like, well, build a framework around it, right? For safety, for taxation, all the benefits, right? Structure, keep it out of the hands of kids, et cetera, et cetera. So, we've got this situation where New York is importing a lot of cannabis from other markets for their unlicensed stores, right? And this is what people want. People want these brands, right? People want access to this stuff. And, I think the states have started to talk about it and start to do things about it in the near term. And I feel like it's very much a byproduct of how can we support our operators here. And, one way that might be giving access to a broader market, right? So let's start drafting some regulations that say when the laws permit, we'll allow interstate commerce. And we know Washington and Oregon and California have done that. And now, this week, the big news was out of California, where they're actually looking to, I believe, implement something. They put together a letter, and when they structured this opportunity, I think there were like 4 areas. Like if one of these 4 criteria were met, then they would be like free and clear to pursue it, just like they're free and clear to have a legal framework without federal interference. And so they recently wrote a letter to the Attorney General for the state, kind of asking about an opinion, or asking for an opinion related to this. And I thought it was pretty interesting, the kind of justification and how they point out, why this is okay with the current structure and current legislative structure. They even call out the Blumenauer-McClintock Amendment, which is basically what sits at the federal level to say, hey, federal government, stay out of this, right? No interference allowed. And that's been around for a long time. I think it was like Rohrabacher before.
It was the
And they point,
Rohrabacher, yeah.
yeah. And they point out in the language of the letter, that's not even their like core argument of why this is okay. But they state like that the Rohrabacher-Farr Blumenauer Amendment further insulates California from significant legal risk. So it's like not like, hey, this exists and so we're okay, but it's like it further, just one more layer. So it's got a lot of things there. I'm no legal expert, and certainly no expert on state law and how this works. There's all sorts of nuance to this, like the Commerce Clause, which we've talked about on previous calls, which is quite confusing, big picture. But the idea that like the Commerce Clause is like the federal government can't interfere with, or states can't prohibit interstate commerce in certain ways, and it was used a lot in the civil rights movement, if you remember. And that's how they justified to say you have to be able to serve everybody because you're restricting trade from people like outside of the state. And it's a wild thing to think that commerce was used to help with civil rights, but it's like the federal government doesn't have a lot of levers when it comes to that. And so that was a big driving force. And I think that the letter does touch on the Commerce Clause, which restricts states from enforcing laws that unduly restrict interstate commerce. So it's like, one state can't say, well, you can't, people from, Texas can't come to Colorado and buy whatever. It's protected by the Commerce Clause. So anyways, there's nuance to it. If you're into that sort of thing, we'll certainly link to it. You might have seen it already, but really what I want to talk about, um, and not debate like necessarily the merits of their argument, like how strong will this hold up? Because certainly I will lose that debate because I have no idea. But really, like, let's imagine a world where the AG of California goes, "Hey, you know what? You're right. You're right. Okay." And California says, "Hey, we're good." And then the other states follow pretty quickly, right? And then all of a sudden, is there interstate commerce amongst these states with a pact? And if so, what does that look like?
Well, okay, so maybe we should just start by saying, what if the 3 states on the Western Seaboard agreed to this, right?
Yeah, let's just
So,
keep it a
yeah,
microcosm. The
let's
states
just
that have already
yeah,
passed the
yeah,
language that will
because then we're
permit it.
not
Yeah.
dealing yeah, we're not dealing with the flyover drive-through issues of, like, an Idaho, which will say, like,
No,
"No
no,
fucking
just
way."
the
Yeah.
states with the
Ooh,
compact right now,
yeah,
right?
exactly. Okay, so it's an interesting question. I'm not sure that it my biggest concern is that one of the best and highest functioning operations or groups that knows how to already distribute in interstate commerce is the illicit market. And I think the most difficult and sophisticated competitor to our market is the illicit market, even and especially maybe even on the West Coast. I mean, Oklahoma is a specific outlier in the middle. It's like an oasis of illicit cannabis cultivation. But Southern Oregon has been noted for having massive cartel and illicit cultivation operations going on because it's just largely unchecked. And same thing with wide swaths of Northern California, which for those of us who care about the environment or care about the legal market, it's just a nightmare because the and humans, the cartels, hurt people, kill people, destroy the environment, including our national parks and our state parks up there. And I don't think it's any different in Oregon. And I think but they've been doing this the whole time, and they've been trafficking it across state lines the whole time. And in fact, a lot of us that watched the implosion of the wholesale pricing in California, a lot of that was driven by Southern Oregon outdoor and grown cannabis. Just as well as the illicit operators in California. Washington is a little bit of a different animal because of the fact that you really cannot be a full vertical license holder. So the retailers hold power over the cultivators in an interesting way. And then there's these other things that go on. But so I'm just talking through this in a little bit of a clumsy format, but I just want to share that I think there are these other conditions that exist that we can't ignore that I'm not sure
Right.
interstate commerce solves for.
Hmm.
I don't know, what do you think about this? I think and because the ultimate issue, which we've talked about repeatedly on the show, when you've done the great job of pointing out like the massive cannabis deserts that exist in California still, in the very limited number of retail doors that exist, and then you've got these like weird supply demand and access issues in California where you have too many stores in certain locations. Like West Hollywood, LA has like so many retail doors, but then you'll have a wide desert of no retail across the state of California. And I think that that's really where the issue lies. So maybe we open this up across the borders, but if we still can't get it into the hands of the consumer through the legal regulated market, I'm not sure what it will do for the cultivators and the supply chain. What do you think about this?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think that I mean, one, I guess I like this as like a precedent thing, and
Mhm.
sure, Oregon, Washington, California do it. Maybe others follow quickly with a path forward. And what I like about that is like it starts to overlay, what looks like a more traditional industry, right? Like when you think about
Mhm.
wine and like
Mhm.
I'm in Washington and I'm a member of like a number of wine clubs in California that, ship wine here, right? And it's great.
Mhm.
It's great, right? And I cannot do that with California brands, right? It's like
True.
if I go visit, I can go pick some stuff up and technically, illicitly bring it across with me, right? But it's like I can't just ship it or I can't get it, at the store, right? So in that sense, I think it's really neat, and I think, that's what we want to see ultimately. Like, I want to see a world that looks like that.
I think you're making a really good point too. Like I'm thinking just about wholesale, but in terms of product reach and access, there is a very strong case because I do think the product companies and branded products in general are going to go through a very difficult cycle right now in Canada. It's always been difficult, but it'll be extra difficult. And one of the ways this could be alleviated, and this then here comes my, you know me, I'm going to always ask questions, is like, okay, so how are we, if Washington, you know this better than anybody, you guys have to clean and normalize data. So if Washington state has regulations about the labeling, packaging, the dosing, and the testing requirements of a product, and California has a fully different level of requirements, how's that going to look? You know what I mean? Like, and same thing with Oregon. And so, you know, I guess like the exciting thing for this is that a brand could then all of a sudden have reach across 3 states without having to set up a separate vertical within each state, which is very expensive. You don't get the economies of scale you could if you were able to just do this interstate commerce. To your point, like even you could have a fairly effective potentially e-commerce model around shipping product, just like the wineries, or even like the cider, like that Tin City cider that I belong to, and they ship me those things. So from Paso Robles. And
Paso
so
Robles, yeah.
yeah, so I think that's an interesting point of view from a product perspective, branded products. But I would imagine, and was this talked about anywhere, and did I miss it, that they would talk about creating kind of a treaties around
Packaging
product,
and product requirements.
yeah,
No,
testing
I mean,
require. I mean,
it
because
could be
like
there. I didn't see anything, but I don't
see the
I don't
yeah.
know. Yeah, I don't know. It's
Yeah,
a
I
good
guess,
question.
yeah, but I do think it's interesting from a product standpoint. And so that's a good point of view that you just offered up.
Yeah, so in that sense, I think it's kind of
Hmm.
exciting. I think that, but it's still, I mean, it's great, right? You're trying to build a brand, you're trying to get a large brand footprint, and you're doing these deals. Like, listen to the Wana episode, right, where we talked
Hmm.
to Nancy and their structure, because they were one of the first, with like a very large footprint, out there, by doing licensing deals. And it's still challenging, right? And a big challenge with that is control, and like understanding like the product is of the quality that they expect. And all the products that you know and love from Wana and Colorado are available everywhere, which is not the case. And so, just simplifying that, making it easier, even if it is different packaging requirements, like different labels or maybe different testing. If they could still produce it probably in one place and ship, it's probably going to be easier than going through that structure. So that's exciting. But then, when you think about where the market is, right, with not enough retail access in places like California, if you have a lot of brands coming down from like Washington, which has a lot of brands, I think per capita more brands than any state. There's more brands in a given retailer than any market. And some of those do show up in California, like the Forefront Ventures brands are down there, but it's pretty rare. But let's say they come pouring in. Are they gonna find an audience? Are they gonna find access, right, where it's already so tough? Like, the market is hard for the California operators. So how's it going to be any better for Washington operators or Oregon operators that are coming in, and vice versa? Like, Washington is like not growing particularly well. Like, I think it grew compound annual growth rate in 2022 of like 2 to 3%, over from 2019, right? But it declined, right, in 2022 versus 21, like every market, but still, growing on that trend line. The whole pandemic sales stuff conversation. Anyways, but when you look at Washington versus a market like California is growing at a much higher compound annual growth rate clip, right? And so, like, are the California brands going to have a good opportunity in Washington? Maybe they carry so much weight. Maybe there's so much demand. But at the same time, we see brands like Steezy here in Washington, and they actually
Yeah.
don't perform. They really don't perform near like at any level. And again, it goes to licensing structure. I don't know the nuance of the agreement and the partnership that the group that they're working with. Like, who knows, right? But when a brand has that much kind of clout and customer retention, which we see in the data and Headset in a market like California, and then they just like flat out are just buried in Washington, uh, is that because I mean, there could be a lot of things. I think I always talk about the consumer in a market like Washington is no different than the consumer in a market like California. Like someone in Seattle is pretty similar to someone in San Francisco. They're not that different as far as like tastes. And if that consumer is not buying in Washington, like why is it, right? And it doesn't have to do with the brand not being here directly, because Steezy doesn't have the firepower of their marketing engine, of their what they would if they were running it directly, right? So maybe they would be a better performer here in Washington. So it's all hypotheticals, but I think that I think they would have to be. I think because you'd have the full resources and the full expertise. But I also know that it's a different world. I mean, it'll start to blend as this stuff goes on. But day one, like Washington looks a lot different than California. Price points are different. Product mix is different. Types of brands are different. So they're competing in a different arena in the near term. But then longer term, right, as stuff washes out, more brands cross state lines, then it starts to become the same arena, right? California looks a lot like Washington because it's the same brands on both sides, and the price point starts to stabilize. And then maybe that's where they really pull ahead. So like near term, maybe nothing. Longer term, I think it's important. And I do think that this is the way every other industry is. And I don't know why cannabis has to be different, where it has to be state by state. Plus, it's just harder work for us at Headset. Like it's so much harder because we have to do every state is different. Every product is in that state and is tracked differently, is coded differently, and that's a lot of work. In Canada, it's more of like interstate commerce, right? Because you can be a brand in Ontario and distribute out across all the provinces, right? And we still see different purchase behavior patterns, but some of that has to do with investments that these brands are making in different provinces. Some of it has to do with the distributors they're working with. um, there's so many variables, with marketing and everything, just make it hard, but it will look more like Canada, which just means like less brands in that regard, right? It'll be tough for a lot of these brands that maybe are surviving in their little microcosm, like big fish in a small pond, and then here comes a lot of big fish from a bigger pond. You might not make it, right? And you can escape your pond into the bigger pond, but now you're all of a sudden a small fish in California. So I don't know, but like everything with this space, like I just love to see something. I'd like something new, something different, some momentum. And so if this were to go through, whether it's helpful or not for the operators, I think longer term it will be, but near term it might prove to be like a nothing issue, like near term. But and to the wholesale side, a totally different dynamic, right? Where there's just like tons of cheap product that gets distilled in. That's a whole nother conversation. I'm just thinking about the consumer experience, like my experience as a consumer going to a store. What can I buy? What do I have access to? And that's exciting for me as a consumer.
I think you're right. And I think I would love to see Fire Ass Mids down here in California from Washington State. That's my favorite brand.
That will be
But I
a
think
small fish in a small pond that turns into a big fish in a big pond. Like
that baby is
for
set
sure.
to run, especially in this economy. What a freaking amazing brand. But I think that I do want to jog back to one thing you said, which is about the growth of Washington State lagging behind the growth of California, even in spite of like the COVID hiccup that we all just are starting to. I think everybody, by the way, it's not just cannabis that's looking beyond that; it's all other markets because we're all trying to like remove that bizarro moment of history and refocus on what businesses look like in the real world. But you made a great point a couple of podcasts ago about that, which is that Washington has done nothing to innovate the consumer experience. Like they haven't thought about lounges. They haven't looked at delivery. They haven't, or maybe they've looked at it, but they haven't done anything. And I
Nope.
do think
Yeah,
the
nothing.
regulators, like this is a big swing at the fence for the fences, on interstate commerce. But I think I would love to see the regulators interact with the business community and talk about these things, talk about, let's go for the big swing because you're absolutely right. I mean, this is where we go someday is interstate commerce. This is where we will end up. When is another question, and what it will look like is another question, but we will get there. And that is really where we should be thinking about for the future. But we have to act in the interim. And I think there could be these other steps like the importance of opening more retail and the contemplation of, like you were just saying, like people are smoking weed in Times Square, which, by the way, that is not where I would smoke weed personally. Just it's not a laid
It's
back
just all
environment for me.
the Elmo costumes that are doing it.
Just, I mean, could
Mickey
you
Mouse
imagine
and-
if like one of the, no, absolutely. Like that is chaos for me. In fact, if I can avoid Times Square, I do at all costs. But I think the point is a good one. Like there should be social experiences, just like when we had our friends on the pod and we talked about the lounges. And I think that is where you unlock interesting value for the entire experience. And I think it does create a potential second wind to a market where there's a novel experience around it, more access, and frankly, you can consume it in a place. So I think it would be great if we could take two approaches, which is looking locally at what could be done to stimulate businesses or stimulate the industry, but also think about the bigger picture and how we can get there. So I think there's a lot of work to do, but we'll see.
Yeah, we'll see. And certainly, always interesting to see how these play out. And this is pretty unprecedented. And that's another exciting thing. It's kind of like pushing states' rights and everything, through the lens of cannabis here. So very exciting to see whether it happens or not. Let's hope it happens for the at the very least, so you can get access to fire ass mids down there.
Or I just have to get back to Seattle.
Or that'll work too.
Thanks for listening to the High Rise Podcast, presented by Headset. For more information on Headset, visit headset.io.